Chapter 2. Erland's house priest at Huseby had taught the three eldest sons their books. They were not over-diligent scholars, but they were apt to learn, all three, and their mother, who herself had been brought up so learnedly, watched over them, so that they learned much. And the year Björgulf and Nicolaus were at Tautra cloister with Sira Eilif, they had sucked, so said the priest, at the breasts of Lady Knowledge with fiery zeal. The teacher there was an aged monk who, busy as a bee, had gathered learning his whole life long from all the books he could come by, Latin or Norse. Sira Eilif was himself a lover of wisdom, but in the years at Huseby he had had little chance to follow his bent towards book learning. For him, the fellowship with Lector Aslak was like satyr pasture to starved cattle. And the two young boys who among the monks clung to their home priest followed open-mouthed the two men's learned talk. And Brother Aslak and Sira Eilif found delight in feeding the two young minds with the most delicious honey from the cloister's bookshelves, whereto Brother Aslak himself had added many copies and excerpts from the choicest books. Soon the boys became so skilled that the monk had rarely need to speak to them in the Norse tongue, and when their parents came to fetch them, they both could answer the priest in Latin, glibly and without many slips. This learning the brothers had kept up since. There were many books at Jorungard. Lavrans had owned 5. Of these, 'twas true 2 had gone to Ramborg at the parting of the estate, but she had never had a mind to learn to read, and Simon was not so skilled in letters that he cared to read for pleasure's sake, though he could both read a letter and write one himself well enough. Therefore he had asked Kristin to keep the books until his children grew bigger. 3 books, which had belonged to his parents, Erland gave to Kristin some little time after they were wed, and yet another book she had got in gift from Gunnulf Nicolausen. He himself had had the matter of it brought together and written down for his brother's wife out of books on Holy Olaf and his miracles, some other sagas of the saints, and the writing the Franciscans in Oslo had sent to the Pope concerning Brother Edvard Rickardson, praying that he might be canonized. And last of all, Nakvi had got a prayer book from Sira Eilif when they parted. So Nakvi read much to his brother. He read easily and well, with somewhat of a singing voice, just as Brother Aslak had taught him. But he liked best the Latin books, his own prayer book, and one that had been Lavrans Björgulfsson's. Yet most of all he prized a great book of a passing fair script that had come down as heirloom in his kin from their renowned forefather, Bishop Nicolaus Arneson himself. Kristin would fain have got some learning for her younger sons too, as was but fitting for men of their birth. But it was not easy to see how this could be done. Sira Eirik was all too old, and Sira Solmund could but read from the books he used at Mass, and many things in what he read he didn't understand well himself. Lavrans would now and again of an evening find pleasure in sitting by Nakvi and letting his brother teach him from the letters on the wax tablet. But the other 3 had no mind at all to win such knowledge. One day Kristin took a Norse book and bade Gaut see if he remembered anything of what he had learned in his childhood from Sira Eilif. But Gaut could not contrive to spell out 3 words, and when he came upon the first sign standing for several letters, he shut the book up laughing and said he did not like to play that game. Now it was for this reason that Cyrus Solmund, one evening in the late summer, came and prayed Nicolaus to come home with him. An outland knight who was come from the Olaf's Mass at Nidaros had borrowed a house at Romengard, but neither he nor his esquires and servants had the Norse tongue. The guide who had brought them hither understood only a word or two of their talk. Sire Eirik lay sick. Could not Nicolaus come and speak with the knight in Latin? Nicolaus seemed pleased to be sent for thus to interpret, but he made as though it was nothing and went with the priest. He came home very late in the night, in high feather and not a little drunk. It was wine he had been given. The stranger knight had store of it with him, and had set it flowing, for the priest and the deacon, and Narkvi too, something too freely. He was named somewhat like Sir Alan, or Allard of Beckelar. He was from Flanders, and was on pilgrimage to the holy places round about the north countries. He was friendly beyond measure, and the talking had gone smoothly. And then Narkvi brought forth his message. The knight was bound hence to Oslo, and thereafter to places of pilgrimage in Denmark and Germany, and he was bent on having Nicolaus ride with him and be his interpreter, at least while yet he was here in Norway. And besides, he had dropped a hint that if the young man would follow him out into the world, Sir Allard was the man to make his fortune. It seemed as though, in the land he came from, golden spurs and neck chains, heavy money purses and goodly weapons did but lie waiting for such a young man as Nicolaus Erlendsson to come and pick them up. Narkvi had answered that he was yet under age and must have his father's leave. But Sir Allard had pressed a gift upon him none the less. 'Twould in no wise bind him, he had said plainly. A half-length plum-coloured silken jerkin, with silver bells on the sleeve flaps. Erland listened to him, all but silent, with a strangely high-wrought look. When Narkvi was done speaking, he sent Gout for the casket with his writing gear, and straightway set about writing a letter in Latin. Björgulf had to help him, for Narkvi was in no case to be of much use, and his father had sent him to bed. In the letter it was written that Erland bade the knight to his home next day after prime, that they might talk of Sir Allard's proffer to take the well-born young man Nicolaus Erlendsson into his service as his esquire. He begged the knight to forgive that he sent back the proffered gift, with the prayer that Sir Allard would have it in his keeping until Nicolaus, with his father's allowance, had taken oath in the service of the stranger, in accordance with the use prevailing among the knighthood of all lands. Erland dropped a little wax at the bottom of the letter and pressed his small seal, that on his ring, lightly down on it. Then forthwith he sent a serving man to Romengard with the letter and the silken jerkin. "Husband, surely you cannot think to send our young son into foreign lands with an unknown man and an outlander?" said Kristin, trembling. "We must see." Erland smiled so strangely. "But I think that it is not likely to happen," said he, when he saw her disquietude. He smiled something more broadly and stroked her cheek. At Erland's bidding, Kristin had strewn the floor of the upper hall with juniper and flowers, spread the best cushions on the benches, and set the board with a linen cloth and good meat in trenches of fine wood, and drink in the rare silver-mounted drinking horns that the manor had in heritage from Lavrans. Erland had shaven himself with care, curled his hair, and clad himself in a black, richly broidered long coat of foreign cloth. He went to the gate of the manor to meet the guest, and when they came across the courtyard together, Kristin could not but think her husband looked far more like one of those knights of Valand of whom the sagas tell than did the fat, fair stranger in gay and motley garments of sarcenet and velvet. She stood upon the balcony of the upper hall, bravely decked and adorned with a silken coif. The Fleming kissed her hand when she bade him bienvenue, and nothing more was said between her and him in the hours he was with them. She understood nothing of the men's parleyings, neither did Sire Solmund, who was with his guest. But the priest said to the mistress that hereby he had surely made Nicolaus's fortune. She answered neither yes nor no. Erland had a little French, and spoke glibly such German as hireling soldiers use, and the talk between him and the stranger knight went smoothly and in courtly wise. But Kristin noticed that the Fleming seemed not well pleased as it went on, although he strove to hide this. His sons Erland had bidden wait over in the new storehouse loft, till he sent them word to come up hither. But no message was sent for them. Erland and the mistress went with the knight and the priest to the gate. When the guests were lost to sight among the fields, Erland turned to Kristin and said with a smile that she misliked, "With yonder fellow I would not send Narkvi from home as far as to Breeden even." Ulf Haldarsson came up to them. He and Erland spoke somewhat that Kristin could not hear, but Ulf swore fiercely and spat. Erland laughed and patted the man's shoulder. "Ha! Had I been such a stay-at-home as the good farmers here, but I have seen so much. I promise you 'tis not I will sell my fair young falcons from out of our hands and into the devil's." Sire Solomon had understood nothing, the holy calf's head. Kristin stood with hanging arms. The colour came and went in her face. Horror and shame took hold of her, so that she felt sick. Her legs seemed to fail her. Sure enough, she had known such things were, as of something immeasurably far off, but that this unnameable thing dared thrust itself right into her very threshold, it was as the last billow that must needs overturn her storm-tossed, overladen boat. Holy Mary! Must she go in dread of such things too, for her sons? Erland said with the same ill-favoured smile, "I had thought so yesterday already. Sir Allard seemed to have somewhat too much of courtesy by what Narkvi said. I know well 'tis no knightly use anywhere in the world to greet a lad one would take in service with a kiss on the mouth, nor to give him costly gifts ere he has made proof of his worth." Trembling from head to foot, Kristin said, "Why did you bade me strew the floor with roses, and spread my board with linen cloths for such a—" She spoke the worst of words. Erland knit his brows. He had picked up a stone, keeping an eye on Munen's red cat, which was stealing flat on its belly through the long grass under the house wall towards the chickens by the stable door. He flung the stone. The cat was round the corner in a flash, and the bevy of hens flounced hither and thither. He turned to his wife. "I thought I might as well see the man. Had he been a trustworthy fellow, then, to see him I must show him courtesy. I am not Sir Allard's confessor, and you heard, I think, he is bound for Oslo." Erland laughed again. "Now, like enough, some of my true friends and dear whilom kinsmen may hear tell that we don't sit here at Jorengard either, lousing our rags and eating herring and oatmeal bannock." Björgulf had the headache and lay abed when Kristin came up into the loft at supper time. And Narkvi said somewhat of not going over to the hall to supper. "I think you are dull this evening, son," said his mother to him. "How can you think so, mother?" Narkvi smiled scornfully. "That I seem to be a bigger fool than other men, and 'tis easier to throw dust in my eyes, is nothing to be upset about, for sure." "Take comfort," said his father, when they sat at the board and Narkvi was still more silent than his wont. "You will come out into the world yet to try your fortune." "That depends, father," answered Narkvi, low, as if he meant Erland alone to hear, "on whether Björgulf can bear me company." Then he laughed quietly. "But say to Ivar and Skule what you have said to me. 'Tis their one longing, I think, to grow up and be of an age to go into the world." Kristin stood up and drew on a hooded cloak. She told the others she was going north, to the old beggar man in Ingeborg's cottage. The twins offered to go along and carry the sack for her, but she would rather go alone. The evenings were somewhat dark already, and north of the church the road ran through woods and under the shadow of Hammer Hill. Here cold gusts always blew from out of the gorge, and the river's roar seemed to bring with it a breath of damp. Swarms of great white moths hovered and flickered under the trees. Sometimes they swept right against the woman. It seemed as, in the dusk, the palely shining linen about her head and breast lured them. She beat at them with her hands as she hastened upward, slipping on the smooth pine-needle carpet and stumbling on the writhen roots that wound across the path she followed. There was a dream that had haunted Kristin for many a year. The first time she had dreamed it was the night before Gaut was born. But even now it would chance that she walked all a sweat, with her heart hammering as if it would beat itself in sunder in her breast, and knew that she had dreamed the self-same dream. She saw a flowery lawn, a steep hillside deep in pine forest that hemmed in the green sward on three sides, thick and murky. At the foot of the slope a little tarn mirrored the dark woods and the green-spangled clearing. The sun was behind the trees. From the very top of the hillside the last golden light of evening sifted in long rays through the firs, and in the depths of the tarn shining sunset clouds swam amidst the water-lily leaves. In the midst of the slope, standing deep in the scree of campions and buttercups and foamy clouds of the green-white angelica, she saw her child. It must have been Nakvi, the first time she dreamed it. She had but the two then, and Björgulf yet lay in his cradle. Afterwards, she never knew for sure which of her children it might be. The little round sunburnt face under the round cropped yellow-brown hair seemed to her now like one, now like another. But always the child was 2 to 3 years old, and clad in just such a little dark yellow coat as she used to sew for her little boys' everyday wear, of homespun wool, dyed with litmus and edged with red binding. She herself, it seemed to her at times, was on the farther side of the tarn. Or she was not at the place at all, but yet she saw everything that happened. She saw her little son move hither and thither and turn his face as he plucked the flowers. And a dull fear pressed heavy on her heart, a foreboding of an evil thing to come. Yet first there came, always with this dream, a mighty aching sweetness as she gazed at the fair child there in the meadow. Then she grows aware that from out of the dark up in the forest fringe there parts itself a shaggy living bulk. It moves without a sound. 2 tiny wicked eyes glare out. Right out onto the upper meadow comes the bear, stands and sways its head and shoulders, sniffing downwards. Then it springs. Kristin had never seen a living bear, but she knows they don't spring like that. This is no ordinary bear. This moves like a cat. Now it turns grey, like a grey, shaggy giant cat. It leaps with long, lithe bounds down the grassy slope. The mother watches with the anguish of death upon her. She cannot go where the little one is to save him. She cannot warn him with the sound. Then the child grows aware that something is there. It turns half around and looks over its shoulder. With a dreadful low cry, with a dreadful little low cry of fear, it tries to run down the slope, lifting its legs as little children do high in the long grass. And the mother hears clearly the little sounds of the sappy stalks breaking as the child pushes its way through the tangled growth of flowers. Then it stumbles on something in the grass, falls headlong, and next moment the monster is on top of it with arched back and head thrust deep between its forepaws. Then she wakes. And each time she lay awake for hours before she could calm herself by thinking it was but a dream. Her smallest child that lay between her and the wall, she would draw close into her, would think of how, had it been real, she might have done this or that, frightened the monster with shrieks or with a staff, and at her belt there ever hung the long keen knife. No sooner had she talked herself into quietness in this way than it would break over her anew the unbearable agony as, in her dream, she stood strengthless and saw her little one's poor, vain efforts to flee from the deadly, swift and strong and cruel beast. She felt as though the blood boiled and surged within her, as though her body swelled and her heart must burst, since it could not contain such a wave of blood. The cottage, called Ingeborg's Cot, lay up on Hammer Hill, a little below the highway, which here pressed up the height. It had stood empty many a year, and the ground was leased to a man who had got leave to clear a place and build close by. An old beggar man, left behind from a gang of mumpers, had now got leave to creep in there. When she had heard of it, Kristin had sent up meat and clothes and healing simples, but she herself had till now no time to go hither. 'Twould soon be all over with the poor man, she saw. She gave her sack to the beggar woman who had stayed behind with him, did the little she now could to ease him, and when she learned that they had sent for the priest, she washed his face and hands and feet, that they might be clean and ready for his last anointing. It was thick with smoke in the little hovel, and there was a horrible, sickly, foul stench. When two of the settlers' womenfolk came in, Kristin asked them to come to Jorengard for all they might need, then said farewell and went. A strange, sick fear of meeting the priest with the Lord's body had come upon her, and she turned aside into the first by-path she came to. That it was nothing but a cattle path she soon saw. She found herself plunged in trackless wilderness. Fallen trees with their high, tangled masses of roots were fearsome to look on. She had to creep over them when she could not find a way around. Flakes of moss slipped from under her feet when she had to scramble down amongst great stones. Cobwebs clung to her face, and branches struck her and took hold on her clothes. When she had to pass over a trickling beck, or come to a low, swampy opening in the forest, it was nigh impossible to find a place where she could slip through the thick, wet scrub of leafy bushes. And the loathly white moths were everywhere, thick under the trees in the dark, swarming up in great clouds from off the heather tufts where she trod. But at length she came out on the low hills down towards the Lagan. Here the fir wood was scant and sparse, for here the trees must send their roots twisting far over the barren rock, and the forest floor was little else but dry, grey-white reindeer moss that crackled beneath her feet. Amid it, stray tufts of heather stood out black. The smell of the pine needles was hotter and drier and sharper than higher up. Hereabout the forest always showed scorched and yellow needles from right early in the spring. The white moths still kept after her. The thunder of the river drew her downward. She went right out on the edge and looked down. Deep down below, the water shimmered white where it boiled thundering over the slaty rocks from pool to pool. The changeless roar of the falls went quivering through her overwrought body and soul. It reminded her of something, of a time endlessly long since. Even then she had known that she could not bear the lot she had chosen for herself. She had laid open her shielded, tender girlhood's life to ravaging fleshly love. In dread had she lived ever since, bondswoman from the first hour of motherhood. To the world she had given herself up in her youth, and the more she struggled and fluttered in the world's snare, the more straitly she found herself bound and prisoned by the world. Her sons she strove to guard, with vainly flapping wings tied down by worldly cares. Her dread, her unspeakable weakness, she had striven to hide from all men, had gone forward with a straight back and a calm face, held her peace, and fought to safeguard her children's welfare in every way she could. But ever came that hidden, breathless fear. If they fare ill, it were more than I can bear. And the deeps of her heart made moan at the memory of her father and mother. Even as they had walked, laden with fear and care for their children, day after day forward unto death, they had had strength to bear their burden. And 'twas not that they loved their children less, but that they loved them with a better love. And was she now to see her strife end thus? Had she but reared a brood of restless little birds, who lay in her nest impatiently waiting the hour when their wings would bear them out over the farthest blue fells, and their father clapped his hands together and laughed, "Fly, fly, fly, my young birds!" Bloody fibres from her heart's roots they would drag with them when they took flight, and they would know nothing of it. And she would be left behind to sit alone, and all the heartstrings which once had bound her to this old home of hers, she herself had torn asunder long ago. Surely it would be such a life as is neither life nor death. She turned and half ran with stumbling steps up over the pale, sere carpet of reindeer moss, her cloak gathered tightly about her, for it was so uncanny when it caught in the bushes. At last she came out upon the small hayfields a little north of the guild shelter and the church. As she went slantwise across the field, she was aware of someone standing in the road. He called, "Is it you, Kristin?" She knew it was her husband. "You were away a long time," said Erland. "It is deep night already, Kristin. I began to grow afraid." "Were you afraid for me?" Her voice came from her harder and haughtier than she would have liked. "Not so much afraid either, but it did come to my mind that I had best come and meet you." They scarce spoke a word as they went southward. All was still when they came into the courtyard. Some of the horses they had at home shambled along under the house walls grazing, but all the folk were in bed. Erland went straight to the storehouse loft, but Kristin turned her steps to the kitchen house. I must look for something," she answered to her husband's question. He stood hanging over the balcony waiting for his wife, and then he saw her come out from the kitchen house with a lighted pine-root torch in her hand and go over to the hearth-room house. The man waited a while, then he ran down and went in after her. She had lit a candle and set it on the board. Erland felt a strange chill of fear go through him as he saw her standing there by the lone taper in the empty house. There was nothing in the room but fixed furnishings, and in the candlelight the worn wood glistened, stripped and bare. The hearth was cold and clean swept, save for the pine-root brand which lay there where it had been thrown, still glowing. Erland and Kristin did not often use this room. It might well be half a year since fire had been kindled there. The air was strangely close. The many blended living odours left by man's abidings, his comings and goings, were lacking, and the smoke vent and door had not been opened in all that time, so the place smelt of wool and hides. Some rolled-up skins and sacks, which Kristin had taken out from the wares in the store, were piled up in the empty bed that had been Lavran's and Ranfried's. Strewn on the top of the board lay many small skeins, sewing thread and yarn for mending with, both linen and wool, which Kristin had set apart when she was dyeing. She stood fingering them and setting them in order. Erland sat down on the high seat at the board end. The room seemed strangely wide and empty about the slender man, as it gaped there, stripped of cushions and hangings. The two warriors of St. Olaf, with cross-marked helms and shields that Lavrans had carven for high seat posts, scowled grim and moody out from under Erland's narrow brown hands. No man could carve out leafage and beasts fairer than Lavrans, but with men's semblances he had never been happy. For a long while the two kept so still that not a sound was to be heard, save the dull thuds on the sward outside where the horses wandered in the summer night. "Are you not going to bed soon, Kristin?" he asked at length. "I thought to wait for you." I have no mind to go up yet. I cannot sleep." "What is it that lies so heavy on your mind, Kristin, that will keep you awake?" he asked after a little. Kristin drew herself upright. She stood with a skein of heather-green wool in her hands. She pulled at it and twisted it between her fingers. "What was it you spoke with Nakvi today?" She swallowed once or twice. She was so dry in the throat. "Some plan. 'Twould not do for him, he seemed to think. But you talked of how Ivar and Skule—" "Oh, that!" Erland smiled a little. "I only said to the lad, I have a kinsman by marriage too, now that I think of it. Though Gerlach, I think, will scarcely be so ready to kiss my hands and take from me cloak and sword as he was before. But he has ships on the sea and rich kinsmen, both at Bremen and at Lynn. And sure, the man must understand that it behoves him to help his wife's brothers. I spared not my goods and gear when I was a rich man, and gave my daughter to Gerlach Tidekinson to wife." Kristin said nothing. At last Erland said, somewhat hotly, "Jesus, Kristin, don't stand like that, staring as if you were made of stone." "Little did I think, the time we first came together, that our children should need to wander round the world, begging their bread in strangers' houses." "Oh, the devil fetch me if I meant that they should beg. But should they have, all 7 of them, to wring their bread from your farms here? 'Twill be but peasant's fare, Kristin. And I think my sons are little fit for that. Bully boys they seem like to be, Ivar and Skule, and out in the world there is both wheaten bread and cake for the man who will carve out his meat with his sword." "You want your sons to be hirelings and vassals?" "I hired myself out in the days when I was young and followed Count Jacob. God be gracious to him, I'd say. I learned something then that a man doesn't learn at home in this land of ours. Here either he sits peacocking in his high seat with silver belt about his belly, swilling himself full of ale, or he walks behind his plough, smelling to the rumps of his jades. It was a hearty life I lived in the Count's service, and I do say it, even though I had got that block fast to my leg while yet I was of Nakvi's age. At least I had some joy of my youth." "Be still." Kristin's eyes seemed to grow black. "Would you not think it the deadliest harm if your sons were ensnared in such sin and mischance?" "Sure, God defend them from the like of that. But it were not necessary that they should copy all their father's follies. A man can, sure, take service with a noble Kristin, and without such hangers-on to clog him." "He who draws the sword shall perish by the sword. So it is written, Erland." I have heard it, my dear one. Yet the most of your forefathers and mine made a good and Christian end in their beds with the last anointing and all ghostly comfort. You need but call to mind your own father. He had shown in his youth that he was a man who could wield the sword. "It was in war, Erland. At the bidding of the king they had gone to help guard our homes and hearths, that my father and the others took up arms. Yet father himself said it was not God's will with us that we should bear arms, Christian men, one against the other." "Yes, I know that. But the world is what it is, ever since Adam and Eve ate of the tree, and that was before my time. I'm not to blame. We are born with sin within us."
"Shameful is your talk."
Erland broke in vehemently. "Kristin, you know it well. I was never slow to repent and make amends for my sins as well as might be. I am no godly man, 'tis true. I saw too much when I was a child and a youth. My father was such a dear friend of the great lords of the chapter. They came and went in his house like grey swine. Lord Eilif, when he was priest, and Sir Sigvard Land and all their following. And little else came with them but wrangling and jars. Hard-hearted and unmerciful they were to their own archbishop. They were no more holy and peace-loving than those who each day held in their hands the holiest of holy things and lifted God himself aloft in the bread and wine.
"'Tis not for us to judge the priests. Father ever said was our duty to bow down before their priesthood and obey them, but that their natural man lies under the judgment of Almighty God alone."
"Yes, I know he said that, and you have said it too before now. I know well you are more godly in such like things than I can ever be. Yet, Kristin, 'tis hard for me to see how it should be a right reading of God's word to go on, as your way is, ever storing up wrath and never forgetting. A long memory did he have too, Lavrans. Oh, no, I say nothing of your father, but that he was pious and nobly good, and that you are too as well. But often when you speak so soft and sweet, as if your mouth were filled with honey, I fear you are thinking most upon old wrongs, and God may judge whether your heart is as pious as your mouth." Of a sudden she dropped down, lay over the board with her face hidden on her arms, and wept aloud. Erland sprang up. She lay weeping with hoarse-racking sobs that shook her frame. Erland laid his arm on her shoulders.
"Kristin, what is it?"
"What is it?" he said again, sitting down on the bench beside her and trying to lift her head.
"Kristin, don't weep so. I think you have lost your wits." "I am afraid."
She sat up, clenched her hands in her lap.
"I am so afraid. Mary, gentle lady mine, help us all. I am so afraid. What will become of all my sons?"
"Ah, Kristin mine. But you must get used to the thought you cannot hide them longer beneath your skirts. Soon they will be grown men, all of them. And you are like the bitch still." He sat with one leg over the other, his hands folded over his knee, looking down somewhat wearily at his wife. "You snap blindly both at friend and foe when anything touches your children." She got up sharply and stood a moment dumb, wringing her hands. Then she began to walk swiftly up and down the room. She said nothing, and Erland sat silent, looking at her.
"Skule."
She stopped before the man.
"A luckless name you gave your son, but you would have it. You wanted that the Duke should live again in the child."
"It is a good enough name, Kristin." "Luckless? There is ill luck of many kinds. I remember well when I named my son after my father's mother's father, that fortune betrayed him. But none the less he was king, with better rights than the comb-maker's seed."
"You were proud enough, you and Munin Bardson, that you were of King Hakon Harleg's near kindred?"
"Yes, for you know that my father's aunt, Margaret Skulesdatter, brought kingly blood into Sverre's stock." For a long time man and wife stood and gazed into each other's eyes. "I know what you are thinking, my fair lady wife. Erland went and sat down again in the high seat. With his hands resting on the two warrior heads, he leaned forward a little. He smiled a cold and galling smile. "But you see, Kristin mine, me it has not broken that I am now a poor and friendless man. 'Tis well you should know it. I am not afraid that with me my father's line has fallen for all time from might and honour. I too was betrayed by fortune. But had my plan gone well, then now I and my sons would be sitting in the seats on the king's right hand, that we, his near kinsmen, are born to. For me, the game is up now, perhaps. But I can see it on my sons, Kristin. They will win back the place that befits their birth. You don't need to grieve so for them, and strive not to bind them fast here in this nook-shooten dale of yours. Let them prove themselves freely, and you will see, maybe, before you die, they will have won firm footing again on their father's rightful heritage."
"Oh, you can talk!"
Hot, bitter tears of wrath were pricking in the woman's eyes, but she forced them back and laughed with mouth twisted awry.
"Methinks you are yet more childish than the boys, Erland. You can sit and talk thus, but no longer ago than today Narkvi had well nigh come to such fortune as a Christian man's mouth dare not name, had not God preserved us." "Yes, but this time it was I that had the luck to be God's instrument."
Erland shrugged his shoulders, but then he said most earnestly, "Such things you need not fear, my Kristin.
Is it this that has clean scared the wits from you, poor soul?"
He looked down and said almost shamefacedly,
"You must remember, Kristin, your father of happy memory prayed for our children, as he prayed for all of us, early and late. And I think most surely and firmly it has worked for deliverance from much, from the worst things of all, that we had so good a man interceding for us."
She saw the man cross his breast with his thumb, as though by stealth. But so beside herself was she, it but embittered her the more.
"So you comfort yourself with the thought, Erland, as you sit there in my father's high seat, that your sons will be saved by his prayers, even as they are fed by his lands."
Erland grew pale. "Do you mean, Kristin, that I am unworthy to sit in Lavransdatters high seat?" His wife's lips moved, but could bring forth no sound. Erland rose and stood motionless. "If that is what you mean, for then I say as sure as God is above us both, I will sit there never more. I will never sit there again." "Answer," he said again, as she stood speechless. A long tremor shook the woman's body.
He was a better master, the one who sat there before you."
She could scarce get the words out so as to be heard. "Heed your tongue now, Kristin." Swiftly Erland strode a step or two nearer. She stood upright with a start.
"Aye, strike me. I have borne that too before now. I can bear it again."
"Strike you? I didn't think about that." He stood with his hand resting on the board. Again they gazed at one another, and again his face had that strange far-off calm which he had seen on it at some rare times. Now it drove her to distraction. She knew it was she that was in the right. Erland's talk was witless, reckless, but that face of his made her feel as though all the wrong was hers. She looked at him, and sick with dread herself at what she said, she spoke.
"I am afraid It will not be in my sons that your line will flourish again in the Trondheim country."
Erland flushed blood red. "You could not resist reminding me of Sigrid Undset, I see."
"It was not I who named her, but you."
Erland reddened yet more deeply. "Have you never thought, Kristin, that you were not wholly without blame in that mischance? Do you remember that night in Nidaros? I came and stood before your bed. I was most humble and sorrowful for that I had offended against you, my wife. I came to beg of you to forgive me my wrong. Your answer was to bid me go and lay me where I had lain the night before."
"How could I have known that you had lain by your kinsman's wife?"
Erland stood a little. He grew pale and again red. Then he turned and went from the room without a word. The wife did not stir. For a long time she stood motionless, her clenched hands pressed up beneath her chin, staring into the light. Then she raised her head with a jerk and drew a long breath. Sometime he must endure to hear it. Then she grew aware of the sound of a horse's hoofs in the courtyard, heard by its gait that it was a horse being led by a housecarl. She stole to the door and out into the penthouse, stood behind the doorpost and peered out. Already the night was growing grey with dawn. Out in the courtyard stood Erland and Ulf Haldarsson. Erland held his horse, and she saw that it was saddled and the man clad for riding. The two spoke together for a while, but she could not catch one word. Then Erland swung himself into the saddle and began to ride at a footpace northward to the manor gate. He didn't look back, but seemed to talk with Ulf, who was walking by the horse's side. When they were gone from sight up towards the road, she crept out, hastened as noiselessly as she could up to the gate, stood there and listened. She heard now that Erland had started Soten at a trot up on the highway. A little while after, Ulf came back. He stopped short when he caught sight of the woman there at the gate. For a while they stood looking at each other in the grey twilight. Ulf's feet in his shoes were bare, and he had but a linen shirt beneath his cloak.
"What is this?"
asked the mistress wildly. "You must know, I don't."
"Where was he riding?"
she said again. "To Haugen." Ulf stood a little. "Erland came in and woke me up. He said he would ride thither tonight, and he seemed in haste. There were some things he prayed me to see and have brought up after him." Kristin was silent for a space.
"He was angry then?"
"He was quiet." In a little Ulf said low, "I am afraid, Kristin. I wonder if you have said what had best been left unsaid."
"For once, surely, Erland might endure to be talked to as if he were a grown man," said the wife vehemently. They went slowly downward. Ulf turned towards his own house, and at that she came after him. "Ulf, kinsman,"
she prayed him fearfully.
"In the old days it was you who told me, late and early, that for my son's sake I must harden my heart and speak to Erland."
"Yes, I have grown wiser with the years, Kristin, and you haven't," he answered as before.
"You give me fair comfort, for sure,"
she said bitterly. He laid a hand heavily upon the woman's shoulder, but at first he said nothing. They stood there. It was so still that they both heard the endless roar of the river, that at other times they couldn't hear. Out on the farms around the cocks were crowing, and from the stable Kristin's farm cock sent forth a ringing answer. I have had to learn and deal heedfully with comfort, Kristin. It has been heavily drawn on these many years. We must go sparingly with it now, for we know not how long yet it will need to last. She shook herself free from his hand. With teeth set hard into her lower lip, she turned her face aside. Then she fled downward, back to the hearth-room house. The morning was biting cold. She wrapped her cloak close about her and pulled the hood down over her head. Crouched together, with her dew-wet shoes drawn up beneath her skirt and her arms crossed upon her knees, she sat on the edge of the cold hearth, brooding. Now and again her face quivered, but she did not weep. She must have slept. She started up with an aching back, stiff-limbed and frozen to the marrow. The door stood ajar. She saw that out in the courtyard the sun was shining. Kristin went out into the penthouse. The sun was high already. From down in the home pasture she heard the bell on the horse that had gone lame. She looked across at the new storehouse, and then she was aware that little Munin was standing up on the balcony, peeping out through the railing arches. Her sons! It flashed through her. What had they thought when they awoke and saw their parents' bed unslept in? She ran across the courtyard and up to the child. Munin had nothing on but his shirt. As soon as his mother came to him, he thrust his hand in hers as if he were afraid. Within the loft, none of the lads was yet full clad. None had waked them, she saw. All looked up quickly at their mother and then down again. She took Munin's hose and would have helped him to draw them on. "Where has father gone?" asked Lavrans wonderingly. "Your father rode north to Haugen at early dawn," she answered. She noticed that the big boys hearkened, and she said, "You know he has long said he must go up there sometime and see how it fares with the farm." The two little ones looked up into their mother's face with wide-open, wondering eyes. But the 5 older brothers hid their face from her as they went out of the loft.